everybody. Today we're looking at Module 77, I believe, on prejudice and discrimination. Okay, so the questions we want to consider are what is prejudice and what are its social and emotional roots? And then we're going to look at the cognitive roots of prejudice to see why it comes up, why it's so prevalent and has been so prevalent in our societies. Basically we're focused on prejudice, right? We're going to look at kind of like some statistics on how prejudiced people are. We'll talk about what automatic prejudice is. Then we'll get into the social, emotional, and cognitive roots of prejudice. Okay, so what is prejudice and what are its social and emotional roots? So prejudice is prejudgment, right? It means judging something before you really know about it. It's prejudgment. It's an unjustifiable, usually negative attitude. Remember what an attitude is, right? Towards a group and its members. So attitude has to do with the belief, feelings that predispose you to action, right? So prejudice usually involves stereotyped beliefs, negative feelings, and then a predisposition to discriminatory action. Right, so you got all the parts in there of an attitude, but we're being a little more specific when it comes to prejudice, right? The beliefs themselves are stereotyped. The feelings are usually negative, usually has something to do with fear or anger or aggression. And the action that is taken based on this belief is usually discriminatory, right? Because you're basing it off of something that's unjustifiable. So just like all attitudes, prejudice, right? So this is what I was getting at. It's a three-part mixture of a belief, in this case a stereotype, an emotion, usually for prejudice it's hostility or fear, and then a predisposition to action, in this case to discriminate. Okay, so I believe I'm going to get into this a little more in a minute, but remember that prejudice is not an action. Right? Prejudice is the belief in an emotion and a predisposition to action, but the action itself, that's called discrimination. When you act on the world based on your prejudice, that's called discrimination. That's the action itself. Okay? So probably the most common form, or the one we think of immediately, is this idea of ethnocentrism. This is assuming the superiority of one's ethnic group. This is one example of prejudice, but it's probably the greatest example, as in it's probably the first one most people think of when they hear the word prejudice. So if to believe, right? Notice belief, feel in here are in italics, right? To believe that a person of another ethnicity is somehow inferior or threatening, to feel dislike for that person, and to be hesitant to hire or date that person, which is an action, right, a discriminatory action, is to be prejudiced. Now, here's where I make the distinction, right? Prejudice is the negative attitude that's associated with this, whereas discrimination is the negative behavior, right? Discrimination is the behavior itself. So that would be not hiring somebody based on your stereotype belief and dislike or threatening or angry or fearful feelings toward them. But not giving them the job or not dating them because of those, that's the discrimination part. That's the action. Okay, so So here's a little statistics, right? How prejudiced are people? It's kind of a funny question, but this is a good news type of chart, I suppose, right? We can see this is broken down by when you were born, and essentially, as the generations go on, higher and higher percentages. This is specifically support for interracial dating, right? So as we go on, right, we started down here, born before 1928, a very long time ago. We're only down at 30 to 40%. Now, if you were born 1977 or later, looks like we're up near in the 90s, right? That's only 2009, so we've had 11 years since then. So it'll be interesting to see if this trend continues. But people are becoming essentially, according to this one measure, right, less prejudice, at least overtly, right, outwardly, obviously. So as this overt prejudice wanes, right, which means are you willing to, discriminate in front of a group of people? Are you willing, when asked about a survey, right? Do you support interracial dating? Overt prejudice, they'd be like, yeah, sure. I don't, no, I do not. No, I do not. Right? But somebody who knows they can't say that but still believes it, right, will give the answer that people want to hear, maybe, but kind of hide their prejudice, right? And that's the idea of subtle or covert prejudice, right? And that still exists, obviously, right? That's going to be very hard to uproot. Um, so modern prejudice, right, which would be something like rejecting immigrant minorities as job applicants for supposedly non-racial reasons, is basically replacing the overt or blatant prejudice of saying, you're a minority, I'm not hiring you. Right? They can't say that anymore, so they find other reasons to, right, this idea of modern prejudice, other ways to be discriminatory without being overtly or obviously or upfront about it. For example, right, in the aftermath of 9/11 terrorist attacks, in the Iraq-Afghanistan wars, 4 in 10 Americans, so 40% of Americans, acknowledge some feelings of some feelings of prejudice against Muslims. Most places in the world today still, gays and lesbians cannot comfortably acknowledge who they are and who they love. Saudi Arabia, this actually changed in 2018. I think it was June or July of 2018. Women were not allowed to drive until like a year and a half ago in Saudi Arabia. I'm sure there's still, again, that's a change in the overt, right? But I'm sure there's still much subtle prejudice that lingers there, right? It's only been a year and a half. I'm sure it's manifesting in different ways. This one is just really sad. 95% of children in Chinese orphanages are girls. And then we can think about the idea of the one-child policy that was in effect, no longer in effect, but was in effect for a very long time. If you're only allowed to have one child, apparently, you wanted that child to be a boy. So 95% of the girls, of children in Chinese orphanages were girls because of that. Another thing, how prejudiced are people? People usually prefer to look at slightly feminized computer-generated faces as opposed to masculinized faces. So people would rather look at a feminized face than a masculinized face. Okay. So this is a graph depicting that idea of the in the orphanages, right? But this is a little different. In China, we see that, right, several Asian countries, especially in China, which has mandated that one-child family, or excuse me, one-child policy. Boys are overrepresented, right? According in China, 54.5% of babies were boys. Well, that's not true, right? It's very close to 50-50. And yet China is saying that, oh, we only had 45% girls, 54% boys. Well, that's because there's this idea of the girls not being reported and sent to orphanages. Because if you're only allowed to have one child and you have a girl and you don't want it, you might not report it as even being born. So pretty depressing stuff. That mandate was lifted in China at least. So, hopefully that kind of curtails this trend that we're seeing. Right. Whereas I do think, right, we see here that it's a little over 50%. I think it's not exactly 50-50 in terms of birth rate, but it's a little lopsided on one side. I'm not sure if that's true all around the world. When people were asked which picture of these two do you like best, or which one would have placed an ad seeking a special lady to love and cherish forever, people always said, or I think it was 60, like 2/3 of the time, 66% of the time of the women picked B, right? Because B has slightly feminized features. Basically, they took this picture, put it in a computer, and then touched up, made the features more feminine, and people liked this picture better because of the feminine features. So there's a prejudice towards feminine features in terms of likability. Okay, so we've talked about how prejudiced people are, kind of what it is. Let's talk about the roots, right? And let's start with social roots of prejudice. So if we think about social inequality, there's this idea of the just world phenomenon. This is a tendency for people to believe that the world is just, and therefore people get what they deserve, and they deserve what they get. This is an idea that stereotypes can rationalize inequalities, right? So let's think of an example. Do circumstances of poverty breed a higher crime rate? Yeah, probably, right? If you're in poverty and you can't afford, I don't know, maybe a medicine, you're more likely to steal that medicine, right? That's just one very simple example, but there's hundreds of examples that where poverty could lead to a higher crime rate. Now, what people outside of that situation see is they see, oh, there's a higher crime rate in this area, therefore these people just commit more crimes, so they deserve to live in poverty, right? So that's a stereotype that rationalizes an inequality. Oh, they're in poverty because they commit higher crimes. Well, is it, or is it because that they live in poverty that they need to, or that there's a higher crime rate because of that poverty, right? People. This is the idea of the just world phenomenon, right? Oh, well, if they're in this situation, then they probably deserve to be there. And look, they commit more crimes, so they do deserve to be there. So that's kind of the that's one social root of prejudice. This idea of the just world phenomenon, right? Because if you're on top and everything's hunky dory, you might think the world is just. But if you're on the bottom, right, you're not going to think the world is just at all, right? But you have to take this view if you're seeing inequality. Well, you don't have to, but like you're to make yourself more comfortable, right? If you don't want to think about it, the world must be just, and then you find reasons for why the world isn't just for some people. It's because they deserve it, quotations, right? Not really, but this is the idea of the just world phenomenon. There's also this idea of in-group versus out-group, right? Us versus them. This is a very old idea. So we associate, and this is a simple idea too, we associate ourselves with certain groups and we contrast ourselves with others. We mentally draw circles defining who's us, the in-group, and who's them, the out-group, right? And once we've done that, we form an in-group bias. We favor the group that we're in. It doesn't take very long for that to happen. You could literally, like, you probably experienced this in a classroom, right? I'm like, okay, we're going to play a game. We have team A and team B. It takes like 10 seconds. And all of a sudden, if you're team A, you're like, yeah, team A is number one. Team B is going down, right? You favor your group. But this happens all the time. And depending on what us versus them is, this can lead to, this leads to war. It leads to discrimination, prejudice, racism. Anytime you have those two groups and you make us versus them, all of a sudden, us is better than them. And then from there, you can rationalize a lot of inequalities and a lot of things that just are not just. Right? It's this urge to distinguish enemies from friends. Now, if you think about the evolutionary aspect of that, right? Yeah, that's important. I need to know, if there's a group of other humans out there that is going to kill me, and there's a group that is friendly and that I'm a part of, obviously I'm going to favor the group that's friendly, and I want to be able to recognize them quickly, very quickly, right? Snap judgment as fast as possible, right? So this is built into our genetic code, right? Our DNA is to make these groups know who's our in-group, favor the in-group, and kind of distance the out-group, right? So this us versus them mentality is rooted in our genetics, and you can see how it plays out in the modern world. Every war, countries, anytime us versus them occurs, there's some kind of conflict. And it can be as simple as at a sports game, my team versus your team, people get in fights over that. And there's a million examples. I'm sure you can come up with more. What about the emotional roots of prejudice? Well, there's this idea called the scapegoat theory. And this is the idea that prejudice kind of offers an outlet for anger by providing somebody to blame, right? If we can point at somebody and blame them for something, it provides an outlet for our anger. People lashed out at Arab Americans after 9/11. They had nothing to do with that. They were American citizens, just like you. But because, right, they, look like or seem like they're part of that out group, right? That caused the 9/11 terrorist attacks. We lump them into that group and we lash out. And that the scapegoat theory would say that's an outlet for people's anger. It helps, if we want to boost our sense of status, it helps to have others to denigrate, right? This is why, and we've all experienced this, I believe the Germans call it Schadenfreude, right? This is the idea that it's getting pleasure at someone else's misfortune, right? I think we've all experienced that. And so this is just taken to an extreme in a way. We also see this, right? If you're facing death, threats, experiencing frustration, people will cling more tightly to their in-group, right? Their friends. It's not, this is, pretty straightforward ideas, but when you tie it to these bigger, when you tie it to things like prejudice, it becomes, kind of eye-opening, right? These are some of the emotional roots that can lead to prejudice. An interesting thing, there are very few individuals that they have a genetic disorder called Williams syndrome, and they don't have amygdala activity associated with fear. So they don't feel fear, which, could be very terrible in a situation where you should be afraid of something. But we also see is they display a notable lack of racial stereotypes and prejudice, right? Think about how closely that connects, right? The amygdala controls our fear, that emotion, that basic emotion. Without that, we become less we tend to stereotype less, we tend to be less prejudiced based on race, suggesting that these stereotypes and prejudice that emotion really is rooted in fear, right? Okay, so we talked about social roots, emotional roots, and what about cognitive roots, the way people think? So we are predisposed to form categories, right? That's how we organize the world. Stereotype beliefs are a byproduct of this, of how we cognitively simplify the world, right? If we had a different category for every object that existed, that wouldn't be very helpful. So we make these categories to help us remember things, to help us categorize the world so that we can simplify it in a way we can understand. Now, this can apply to race, and it does, right? This happens in terms of race. In one study, New Zealanders had to quickly classify a bunch of photos by race. And I think they either had to say they were either European or Chinese, okay? And what we noticed is that, so they gave them this blend of faces, right? They have a Chinese person, a Caucasian person, and then they computer generated, they blended the faces in different proportions. If you were of European descent, you more often than those of Chinese descent classified the two middle as Chinese. So we're more, even though this is mostly a Caucasian face, we would group it right into the Chinese. We would say that this is a Chinese face, which just shows, right? By forming categories, we stereotype. Something else, right? When we look at the in-group versus out-group, we can recognize, oh, we're so diverse in our group, right? Look at all the differences we have within our group, but their group, they're all the same, right? So we usually recognize the differences between individuals in our own group, but when we look at a different group, we kind of make them all the same, right? We call that out-group homogeneity, all right? We kind of perceive other groups to be more similar to themselves than the people within our own group, right? They seem to look and act alike while we are more diverse. So we also have greater recognition for faces of our own race, right? This is called the other race effect, also called cross-race effect or own race bias. I prefer the term own race bias. I think that gets right to the point, even though I think the AP exam will use this term, if any. So this emerges really early in life, infancy, 3 and 9 months. We start to be able to recognize, and that makes sense, right? It makes sense. We recognize our family members, and most of the time they are of our race. So, and as a 3 to 9 month-old, right, you need to start categorizing the world to start making sense of it. That's what happens. And these categories, right, they don't just stop at race, they include race too. And this is kind of where, this is one of the cognitive roots of prejudice. And remember, these roots are not evil in and of themselves, right? We need to be able to categorize things, but it's when they're taken to the social extreme, and then, right, it's not just categorization that's bad, it's when you, form the in-group versus out-group, and then you look down upon the out-group because they're all the same, they're not us, they're not as diverse as us, and that can lead to lots of terrible things. It's also, if you remember back to the idea of the availability heuristic, right? Heuristic is like a mental shortcut, right? That allows us to make snap judgments, which is very helpful in a quick situation, but can also lead us astray. And the availability heuristic says that if something is really easy to picture, then we think it happens more often than it does. So one example would be like plane crashes. So plane crashes or shark attacks, right? We see them in movies all the time. They're great, they make great theater, great film, and yet they are very rare occurrences. But because they're so easy to picture, because we've seen them in so many movies, we think they happen more often than they do, and therefore, we're afraid to get on planes or we're afraid to go in the ocean. Even though I think 10 people get attacked all year by sharks, and there's billions of people that swim in the ocean, something like that. So this applies to stereotypes as well, right? Well, I'm going to bring up 9/11 again. Islam was associated with the people who committed the terrorist attacks, right? So what happens is you think of Islam and you picture the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which are burned into people's memories if you were alive at that time. So it becomes a very available image. So when you hear Islam, right, that image is so easily brought up that you link Islam and terrorism when realistically the overlap is, it's even smaller than this, right, if these were accurate sizes. Right, the amount of people who believe in Islam is way bigger than the number of people who are terrorists. And the overlap is even smaller, right? But it's that idea of being able to picture something that allows us to think it occurs more often than it does. So again, believing the world is just is also a cognitive root, right? It's a belief. This leads to victim blaming, right? Oh, this happened to you, then you must deserve it, right? If the world is just, people must get what they deserve. It's also a little bit of hindsight bias, right? Oh, I already know what happened to you, therefore I'm going to kind of explain it based on who you are. Right? This can be taken to extremes that are really depressing. In some countries like Pakistan, women who have been raped have sometimes been sentenced to punishment for having violated a law against adultery. Right? Think about how backwards that is. And that's because, oh, it happened to you, you must have deserved it, and therefore you're the one who's wrong. This is to the extreme of victim blaming, right? She should have known better, right? This is victim blaming. So why do people blame the victim? Well, it reassures people that it couldn't happen to them, right? If people were to believe that anybody could be a victim, then they're afraid that they are just as likely to be a victim. But if you blame the victim and say, oh no, this is your fault, you did something that allowed this to happen, then it reassures people that it couldn't happen to them. Right? So when people are blaming victims, they can't handle the idea that it could happen to them, so they're protecting their own mental state when they do that. Right? We're inclined to see things the way the way they are ought to be. So we see something, we're like, oh yeah, that's how it should be. This natural conservatism, right, victim blaming, hindsight bias, seeing things as the way they should be, and so we shouldn't change them. It makes it very difficult to legislate big social changes like healthcare or climate change. Right? I think I made this slide, 4 or 5 years ago, and that point remains today. Still very difficult to legislate these things because of this idea that people see things as the way they ought to be. The way things are is the way they ought to be, right? Which is like this natural conservatism idea. Okay, so it's kind of a lot there. Some check for understanding questions. Make sure you can answer these three. What is prejudice? What are its social emotional roots? What are the cognitive roots? And make sure you know the difference between prejudice and discrimination. And I'll give you that one real quick. Well, pause if you don't want me to. But right, prejudice, right, is the belief and the attitude, whereas discrimination is the actual, if you're performing some kind of behavior, right, based on that prejudice. All right, that's going to be it for today. I will see you all tomorrow or at office hours. All right, see you later.